Hello, good evening, Tanse, and welcome everyone to this evening's ECAMPing trip, revisiting Edmonton's Métis history. My name is Christina Hardy, and I am descended from the Cunninghams, the Logans, the Larondells, and the Pages. I'm a proud Métis woman with roots to the historic communities of Lac St. Anne, St. Albert, and Egg Lake, which is on the Athabasca Landing Trail. My name is Christina, and I'm the curator of the Edmonton City as Museum Project, fondly known as ECAMP, which is an initiative of the Edmonton Heritage Council. A few pieces of housekeeping before we get started tonight. Please note that our event is being recorded and live streamed to Facebook. So there will be a recording of tonight's event if you wanted to revisit it or share it with someone who couldn't attend. A copy will be available right away on our Facebook page and in time through the Edmonton City as Museum Project website. We encourage to interact with each other using the chat room feature. And when I take a little look, I don't see it at the moment. So if someone on the back end wouldn't mind taking a look for it. If you see the chat room, it should be down at the bottom there. And you can use that chat room in two different ways. So first, you can use it to send a message to everybody participating in the event, a big friendly chat room. Or two, you can use it to send a message directly to myself or the folks who are helping me on the back end or the other panelists. So if something happens and we don't have sound or something weird's going on with our screen sharing, please use that chat room function to let us know what's going on. Please note that there will be a transcript kept of the Zoom chat, but this will not be made publicly available. However, if folks are sharing resource links for other people, we will include those in a post-event resource document that we will email out to you after the event, and we will make it publicly available on our Facebook page as well. I need to give shout outs to Elise and Molly. They're helping me out tonight. So Elise is actually like right there. Yeah, she is the admin assistant with the Edmonton Heritage Council, and she is helping me facilitate the back end of our event. And we have Molly. Molly is one of the communications officers for the Edmonton Heritage Council, and she's helping me out by monitoring and moderating our Facebook live stream. I encourage you all to use that chat room, but please remember to be kind and respectful. And please note that we do have a zero tolerance policy on any type of swearing, harassment, discriminatory speech. We encourage dialogue about this place, but we need to make sure that it's happening in a good way. The Q&A feature. So a large part of today's session is going to be Q&As. So at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a Q&A box, and that's where we encourage you to type your questions for our guests. And we'll be able to track which ones were answered, and there's a really nifty kind of way we can just see it all laid out. So I encourage you to use the chat room feature, or I encourage you to use the Q&A feature rather than the chat room feature when asking us questions. All right, I am going to just kind of go over our schedule for the night. So after my opening remarks, I'm going to be bringing back our guests from last month's ECAMPing trip, Matt Hilterman and Amber Paquette. We're going to come back together, answer a few of the questions that we really liked and that we weren't able to get to at our ECAMPing trip last month. And then we're going to be opening the floor up for questions. And we're really hoping to dedicate a majority of the program to the Q&A session tonight with the goal of wrapping up by 9 p.m. And finally, before I introduce our guests, I must acknowledge that the place in which I am living, the place where my historical work is rooted, and the place from where I am broadcasting this event is located on Indigenous land, land that has been occupied and traveled and cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge that I am in Treaty 6 territory, and that this place, Amiskwaciwâskahikan, the Beaver Hills, Edmonton, is a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for the Nahiwak Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Nitsisapi, the Métis, the Dene, and the Nakota Sioux. And I acknowledge these things not because it's politically correct or a checkbox requirement, but rather because these are the necessary reminders of the history of this place. Treaty and territorial acknowledgements are important contextual grounding points when considering the history of this place, reminding us of parts of our collective history that we are still influenced by and beholden to today. They remind us that we are occupying Indigenous lands. They remind us that Indigenous peoples have traveled and lived and cared for this place since time immemorial. And they remind us that the history of this place did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. However, this part of our collective history, these deep-seated histories and agreements made between nations, have been historically excluded from the stories we tell about the past, excluded from the stories we tell about this place, and excluded, for some, from the stories that we tell about ourselves to ourselves. So, for folks who have come here and for whose families have come here, it is necessary to not forget our obligations as treaty people, to not forget or exclude this part of our shared history, or to position it as something that happened in the past and relevant only to the past. So we must recognize the ongoing legacy and the impact of colonial violence against Indigenous peoples, and how people not Indigenous to this place have benefited and continue to benefit from that violence. And I share this acknowledgement not because I have to, but because these histories and legacies are still relevant to all of us living in this place today. And these histories must always be kept in mind and acknowledged and included when talking about the histories of this place and engaging with the stories of our city. Hi, hi. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce our guests for the evening. So I invite you both to the screen. We have Amber Paquette. Amber is Edmonton's current historian laureate, and she is a Métis multidisciplinary artist, filmmaker, and Indigenous peoples interpreter, born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta. She has worked professionally as a historian, storyteller, and Indigenous peoples interpreter with Fort Edmonton Park for several years, and her work with the public has centered on the daily reenactment of Edmonton's historic fur trade era and the Indigenous cultures and traditions. Amber can trace her ancestry back to many of the prolific founders of early Fort Edmonton, including Cree, Iroquois, French, and Scottish fur traders who played a pivotal role in the city's birth. And she has family connections to the Calahoos, the Lawyers, the Caracontes, the Gauchers, the Cardinals, the Gladdews, the Garapes, and the Noyes family. Hello, Amber, welcome. All right. And we also have Matt Hilterman. Hey, Matt.
Hey.
So Matt is a Métis ethnohistorian, researcher, and public historian, approaching his studies both as a Métis person and from an anthropological perspective. Matt has worked at several museums and heritage sites across Alberta, including Fort Edmonton, Fort Calgary, and Heritage Park, with experience in interpretation, educational programming, and curation. In 2019, he co-curated an exhibit at Laureate House in Calgary entitled Exploring Metis Identity, Past and Present. Matt is descended from the Prudens, the Rosses, the Berlands, the Setters, the Spences, the McDonalds, and the Calders, and will be returning to school in the fall to pursue a Heritage Resource Management Graduate Studies program through the Athabasca University. It is my pleasure to welcome you both back. Hello, how are you doing?
Doing good. It's good to be back.
Yeah, the people wanted you to be back, and I'm so thankful that I can bring you both back. I'm just trying to stop sharing my screen right now. Yeah.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. So in both of your bios, and when I was introducing myself, we all kind of provided those kinship connections. And a big part of being a Métis person and being kind of engaged in Métis history. Being engaged in Métis history. Sorry, we're having a little bit of weird sound going on. But I guess as we get that worked out, maybe I'll just mute Amber at the moment. But Matt, would you like to share a little bit of how did you get kind of involved in this work? What brought you to the things that you are nerdy and passionate about today?
It's actually kind of an interesting story. Growing up, I heard a lot of stuff about it vaguely. Like, my mom was a hobby genealogist, and so she'd talk about like fur trade stuff and like, you know, that whole thing. But as a kid, you know, you don't really care about it because you don't have a whole lot of context for it. Mm-hmm. So I would say I started kind of inquiring into it a bit in high school when I started to notice, you know, little ways that my family was different than most of the families and people I interacted with. Mm-hmm. And it was when I was 16, I got a job at Heritage Park as an interpreter, and they put me in the fort completely like coincidentally. And so, you know, I'd read through the resources and I'd see names that I kind of remember hearing growing up in these like training resources. And it was kind of at that point I started to put two and two together and realize like, hey, this is that like missing thing that I've been trying to make sense of for years, you know, the things that make my family a little quirky. Also the things that, you know, I remember the stories when I was a kid from my mom that, like, again, I didn't have context to appreciate, but like working in that milieu was like, okay, this is what she was talking about. This does matter. This is why it was important. So that was really, I think what got me into it was being able to bridge, you know, my 2008, wow, that was a long time ago, my 2008 life with all the stories I heard growing up. And it just made me want to know more. So I went very quickly and very deeply down that rabbit hole.
Thank you for sharing that. A lot of what you said reminds me of kind of my own similar experience in like kind of always knowing that we were Métis, but
not really getting what that means.
Yeah, not really getting what that means. Yeah. I remember in the 3rd grade, we had to bring like a piece of paper about like a historical family fact. Like we were starting to learn about our heritage in school. Mm-hmm. And my mom wrote down that my great uncle was the first local priest in Alberta.
Yeah. And Edward Cunningham, right?
Yeah, Edward Cunningham. And so when I was a kid, your great uncle seems like so far away. Like who even is my uncle? And I at 9 years old, I wasn't going to question what does a local priest mean.
Yeah. Well, it's like
sorry.
I remember the same project.
Yeah.
And they for me it was that my great grandpa gave Edmonton its name. John Peter Pruden. I mentioned that in the last thing. And just like what you said, great grandpa seems really disconnected. Having said that, I actually grew up with my great grandpa. He passed away when I was like 7. And when I started reconceptualizing it as my great grandpa's great grandpa, rather than great grandpa, it seemed a lot more, I guess, real, if that makes sense.
What about you, Amber? This will be a chance for us to kind of check out the sound. How did you come into this work? And did you kind of understand yourself as a Métis person your entire life, or was it something that you came into?
Yeah, I very much relate to, I think, both of your guys' stories. I was always told growing up that I was Métis, or that I was Cree. How about you?
it just disappeared for a little bit.
I'll be back in like 2 minutes. I really apologize.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I think for the folks watching, I think we're having, at least on my end of things, I'm hearing some weird sounds. So we're going to kind of do some troubleshooting around that. But I encourage everyone to kind of start sending us your questions. We just kind of had a really robust conversation last time about Edmonton's Métis history and had a really good time nerding out and sharing a lot about that. But for us to get started, why don't we kind of return to that drainage map. Matt, why don't you pull that up?
Sure, just give me a second here.
Yeah. So at our last event, someone had asked a question, or asked the question was, what was the significance of this map that Matt's going to be starting to share with us? And it said that it looked like drainage systems with Métis settlements circled. And so we didn't have a chance to talk about that, but we kind of wanted to know or use this as a starting point.
Here, I'll zoom in here. That might make it.
Oh, actually, I just remembered something. I think the our problem solving kind of shot my brain off a little bit. But we released a poll, and I do see that there were about half the folks who are joining us tonight were not at the June 25th ECAMPing trip. So perhaps this is a good opportunity for us to kind of revisit some of the key messages from that past event. And so I'm going to just pull up something here and share a little bit about, so kind of these were the things that last month Matt kind of established as the foundational things that folks kind of need to know when we are starting to talk about Métis history in Edmonton. And so the first one was Métis identity itself. And so the takeaway from your presentation, Matt, was that Métis doesn't mean just half Indigenous and half European. Rather, Métis is a distinct group of a post-European contact Indigenous people, identity, culture, and nationhood. And that Métis identity is specific to the Prairie West. So the Métis people, we emerged from interactions between fur traders and First Nations, especially the Naheplatz in the late 18th and early 19th century, making the Métis a place-specific nation as well as a generational-oriented one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to expand a bit on a couple points you made there. First is that because Métis is specific to a historical and cultural and geographical contingency, even if someone today is half French and half Cree, they're not going to be Métis because they're not necessarily going to be connected to that cultural entity and that ethnic identity. Another point I kind of wanted to get into a little more, but I'll hold off on this till we have Amber back, is the Naheplatz. But for those who don't know, the Naheplatz is a broad political and economic alliance between the Woodland and Plains Cree, the Nakota people, variously known as Stoney, Assiniboine, or Stone Sioux, and the Western Anishinaabe, also sometimes known as Plains Ojibwa, Saulteaux, or Chippewa. And because most Métis can trace their ancestry to those three groups, Métis were, in a manner of speaking, born into that alliance system, if that makes sense.
We have our first question from the group, which I think this might be a really good opportunity to bring it up. So we're talking about Métis identity, and we say that it emerged from interactions between fur traders and First Nations. So Tom Long asks, how useful do you find the term proto-Métis? I find I've used it in describing early individuals from the turn of the 18th century who aren't clearly within Métis culture, like Louise Umperville, but I worry that it can be confusing or have unintended consequences. So how do we use the term proto-Métis? How do we understand it? And are there any pitfalls that we need to be aware of when using that word or framing our thoughts with that?
Yeah, I think that one thing to bear in mind with proto-Métis is that not all proto-Métis or all members of proto-Métis communities developed or descended into the Métis Nation. I know that there are communities, say, in northern Alberta, who may have been, we could argue, were proto-Métis, but over generations became Cree again. Similarly, in parts of the Great Lakes, there are proto-Métis communities whose families didn't migrate westwards and who integrated either into Euro-Canadian or First Nations communities, or in some cases, one could argue, even developed a distinct Indigenous identity that was separate from both First Nations, Europeans, and the Métis Nation. But I don't know enough about that to comment on the full degree of it. It's just like, not all proto-Métis communities led to the Métis Nation, and even among those that did, not all individuals in those communities, descendants, became part of the Métis Nation. So it can be a bit confusing. It's a processual term. It's very diachronic. And all it means is, I think, that the descendants of, some descendants of that community would go on to become Métis. And of course, that does have its limits, because like, you obviously can't extend proto-Métis all the way to, like, you know, the St. Lawrence Valley or Scotland. It has to be within the broader system of the fur trade routes and the buffalo hunts. But basically, yeah, proto-Métis, I think, is useful when describing the social process of Métis in the process of becoming, without necessarily, you know, asserting a fully fledged and formed identity before really it had coalesced. Sorry, that was a bit convoluted, but I hope you understand my meaning.
Yeah. It also bought us some good time to kind of make sure that we've got Amber set up. So hello, Amber.
Hi, really sorry about all that, everybody.
That's all right.
Difficulties.
Yeah. To hop back a little bit to kind of our introductory question, have you always understood yourself as a Métis person, or how did those things kind of evolve in your journey? What are the stories from your family?
Yeah, I very strongly relate to kind of the two of you and what Matt was saying, as like, we kind of, we knew we were Métis, and I was always told that I was Métis or Cree growing up, but it was just never concrete part of my identity, just because the generation before me just was really not comfortable with that identity. They went through a lot of intergenerational trauma. So for me, it's been very much an uncovering of that culture and that history. And really, I'm still kind of on that journey. So yeah.
We almost have to become historians to be able to piece back kind of all of those parts of ourselves, hey?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Being a historian is just, it's kind of like a fluke for me. I never intended to be one, but it's just because I'm following my family's story that is rooted in Edmonton's landscape, and it's Métis history and First Nations history. So yeah, it's a personal and professional journey, which is always very fun.
And a personal journey that has kind of brought you to a place where you are Edmonton's current historian laureate, and you are our first Indigenous historian laureate, which is very important, and I'm really happy to see that. Would you like to share with some folks what you've been working on as Historian Laureate?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's been very exciting. We've been very busy, my team and I. I'm kind of taking a new approach with the laureate position, where we're trying to do it a very collaborative process, and working with a lot of other groups and people and historians and elders and artists to kind of just collectively tell Edmonton's history. So we are working on a series of documentaries, and right now our first episode is in filming, which is very exciting. And that's going to be featuring Strathcona Science Park, and it's a very fascinating history, and its development in the 1980s as a huge kind of science park that the Alberta Culture and the province invested millions of dollars in, and today there's only one interpretive building left, and there's no signs, and it's actually just it's kind of just this neat little hidden chapter in our city's story. So we're going to be kind of just uncovering that and what happened to it with the Black Friday tornado, because that's actually where it met its untimely demise. So it's just very fun, and we're kind of going to be going all over Edmonton's history to different sites and kind of just showcasing what they're all about, from Rossdale to Mary Low Bay Park to Fort Edmonton. So yeah, it's very fun, and it's just yeah, it's very cool.
I can't wait until that work is out in the public and we can all learn from you and get a better understanding of the stories of this place.
Yeah, and it's fun too, because it's kind of like I'm just learning as well, so the documentaries will very much flow in a way where we're all kind of just uncovering all of this together, and we can kind of learn and draw our conclusions from that. So yeah, stay tuned for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that you're both joining us. Kind of revisiting our key messages from the last time, we had been speaking about Metis Identity, and someone had asked, what does Proto-Métis mean? Where is it used? And is it an Eastern Canada idea? I'd briefly say that Proto-Métis is kind of a term that folks were using to describe the descendants of European fur traders and Indigenous women, kind of that first generation that, yes, they were a mix, but with there wasn't kind of the ethnogenesis of the Métis nation or a Métis identity. So it was kind of, what would you, I see your face, Matt. What do you want to jump in?
Sorry, yeah, my understanding of it is a little bit different, because it's not just those early people who were mixed blood. I will say, yeah, for first generation of like people who would eventually become Métis, but a step in Proto-Métis that's necessary in the understanding of the Métis ethnogenesis is the community aspect too, because those early, the parents of those early marriages would live together with similar couples in communities together, and their kids would be raised in these largely mixed blood communities. However, so it's a step beyond just being mixed, but events that unified and galvanized a wide array of these communities, creating a sense of shared, if socially constructed identity, hadn't occurred yet. So you don't have the Battle of Seven Oaks, you don't have the merger yet, you don't have like the convergence on Red River. A lot of these Proto-Métis communities are isolated from one another prior to the events of 1821. And so they haven't developed a shared identity with one another at this point. So they, and it's not an Eastern idea. There were a few Proto-Métis communities in the Great Lakes area, but that's by no means the majority or even the full extent. You get proto-Métis communities as far as Slave Lake. They dot the prairies on the upper Missouri, Athabasca country, Churchill watershed, all throughout the Saskatchewan. And yeah, there are a couple in the Great Lakes. Those proto-Métis communities ended up isolated from the emergent Métis Nation after the merger in 1821. And so those that retained a sense of distinct identity evolved into something other than the modern Métis. But yeah, for those in the West, the merger of the two companies led people from disparate, smaller scale, more localized proto-Métis communities to converge on Red River and develop a sense of shared experience and identity.
And this kind of connects to what our next key message from the last event was kind of our definition of the Métis Nation. So this is kind of how we're coming from those earlier communities into the nation. So that the development of a recognized nation within the political sphere of Canada means that Métis is both a personal and a political identity, and that the Métis Nation covers the more technical aspects of being Métis, such as membership, genealogy, and organization on a broad level. Do you have any connections you want to make there?
Not really a whole lot to add or correct or change. I will say that that is more of like what it is today in 2020. Historically, it was much more, I would say, well, first of all, there wasn't a Canada out here. So to say it was a nation within the political sphere of Canada kind of only works after 1870. Because this wasn't Canada until 1869/70. But it is worth noting that, yeah, it was in the early days when there was no, complex organizational systems. It's still worth noting that Métis identity was very much, who you knew, who you were related to, where you lived, what community you participated in. And so it was very much a social identity more so than a racial one.
Is there anything that you'd like to add on that, Amber?
Oh, yeah, no, it just it's a very much a cultural identity, and it's not rooted in blood quantum at all, for sure. It's definitely who you're related to and in a certain place. And to elaborate a little bit more, I think, on like the proto-Métis concept. Like the Desjardins family, they had like their roots as a proto-Métis family out east, but they eventually ended up traveling out west, right? And that is where they kind of become who they are as Métis people, is coming out here, intermarrying with the people who are here, and participating in key events that make Métis history its history.
Yeah. And to add to that, the Desjardins, going even quite early on, were proto-Métis. But if you trace the different lines of the family, some became part of the Métis Nation and some didn't. And their experiences of those who stayed further east in the Great Lakes area or in parts of the States were categorically different than those who moved west. Even though they're the same family, and even though they're of mixed blood in either case, the proximity to those historical formative experiences is really what separates out the two family lines, as it were.
Yeah, and like I believe the Desjardins family, like that many of some of their members, not many, but some of their members, they became culturally Cree. So,
oh yeah, I've met a lot of Cree Desjardins.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump back to kind of our key messages from the last time. So continuing to lay down our foundation for the conversation tonight. So we've talked about Métis identity. We've talked about the Métis Nation. And then Matt at the last event kind of laid out some reasons why Métis history has been overlooked in Canada. So one of the reasons was that Métis material history is made up of biodegradable materials. So that means homes, transportation, clothing. There's less in collections and archives to make up for the physical history of the Métis. A large part of your presentation was dedicated to the frontier myth, which was a common way that Canada tells the story about itself. And this is harmful to Métis and Indigenous history because it tells the story of a Eurocentric male pioneer figure who forages towards, or who forages forward into the primitive frontier. So this story places the pioneer above those who already existed on the land, and this serves to erase Indigenous settlement. And then another reason that Métis history has been overlooked in Canada, Matt argued, was that Métis people have traditionally held many different family names, and it is the ones of French, English, and Scottish origin that get recorded in our history books, which means that many Métis are assumed to be European, and much of their story is lost because we don't know to look for it. As individuals, Métis people are assumed to be European unless otherwise specified, and Métis collectivity is constructed as being Indian, which leads to the actual Métis experiences getting missed in the gaps between. So these were kind of the three reasons you set out, Matt, about how Métis history falls through the cracks.
And I had a couple thoughts about that yesterday, actually, that I'd like to add. But before I get to that, I just want to clarify for everyone who didn't see last month's presentation that when the term Indian is used there, it is not in reference to actual Indigenous peoples, First Nations or Métis, but rather to what is called either the imaginary Indian or the white man's Indian, which is the Euro-Canadian construction of indigeneity. And really no Indigenous person or people group has ever been the white man's Indian. This is entirely a construct that exists within the mind of colonial society. So I wanted to clarify that point. And so Métis are often defined either in terms of their quote unquote Indianness, i.e. being, historical, nomadic, primitive. There were a few others I had in there, but basically like being, Euro-Canadian society has a set of criteria by which it defines itself. And it constructs its other, in this case, Indigenous peoples, as what it sees itself as not being, or what is antithetical to said self. Therefore, the imaginary Indian is everything that Euro-Canadian society doesn't want itself to be. And so that's no reflection on real Indigenous history or experience. Having said that, Indigenous peoples, whether we're talking Cree, Haudenosaunee, or Métis, whatever, are almost always shoehorned into that imaginary or white man's Indian trope. But the irony is especially profound for Métis because, as Christina mentioned, Métis traditionally have European-sounding names because European names are patrilineal. The result is that when people read a historical text, they'll see a European name and assume, oh, that's a white person, because they have no context for it. And the cultural collectivity that person belongs to is often constructed in terms of the imaginary Indian, basically creating a massive gap between how the aggregate of individual experiences are written about and how the collective experience is written about. So I did want to expand on that a bit. Another note that came up too is that Métis, part of the reason that Métis stuff is so easy to overlook is because people will often take a specific, sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. People will take specific artifacts or constructions remove them from context and then code them as either European or First Nations, rather than looking at the full assemblage of things that, when taken together in a given space, are ultimately Métis. A good example of that is the Erasmus House at Fort Edmonton Park, but I could go on about that for a while. So I'll leave it to those who have been to the park before to look at what I mean when you visit.
Is there anything that you'd like to add on that point, Amber?
No, just I mean, I strongly agree, for sure. There's many layers to why Métis history is right, like it's hidden, but it's also right in front of us, which is it's interesting. There's so many things that could be labeled as Métis history, but they've kind of been, you know, through Western Eurocentric mindsets, been labeled as, quote, settler.
Or in some cases as First Nations.
Or First Nations, yeah. And I think like there's a really good story in my family, I think that plays a lot into this, and that is the murder of my great-great-grandmother's husband, Alex McCulley, who was murdered by a white miner from America, and it was over 2 beaver pelts. And unfortunately, the trial that ensued after that was played a lot on kind of almost manipulating those different ethnic identities in labels, where they would frame Alex. He was technically Métis, but it would frame him as a quarter breed in the media, which means not quarter or anything. It's more just white presenting.
Or even acculturated to Euro-Canadian social standards.
Yes, and then, you know, as the trial goes on, and it's an all-white jury, and there's quite a lot of corruption involved, the lawyer who's defending the accused eventually changes the narrative in his own newspaper. The lawyer was the owner of the newspaper, to a half-breed, and then finally to a crazed Indian. Who would hold people up on the road to kind of justify this poor young man's death. So the terminology is extremely important, and how people were viewing you know, Métis and First Nations people in this totally imaginary construct has done quite a lot of damage. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm kind of just monitoring a bunch of things, so my apologies if it looks like I'm just kind of looking around at screens. I think what I'd like to do right now is to look at the key messages about kind of Métis in Edmonton, but then talk about some examples within the Edmonton context of Métis people who have been kind of misread or misrepresented. So looking at the Métis in Edmonton and Edmonton's Métis history, there is a long presence at Edmonton for as long as it has been known by the name Edmonton. And there is also many Métis settlements in the area, including Lac St. Anne, Duhamel, Long Lake, and St. Albert. So Edmonton is incorporated in a web, a kinscape of Métis people. Many of the early Métis families in Edmonton have ancestors that still live here today. And so I did see that in one of our questions was, how many Métis descendant families live in Edmonton today? And is this community disappearing? I don't know the stats on top of my head, but I would say that no, the Métis community is not one that's disappearing.
No, far to the contrary. It is becoming more and more prolific and vibrant. And honestly, it's the second biggest one in Canada after Winnipeg. So like, that's got to be worth something. Let me just look this up.
Yeah.
Probably one of the fastest growing demographics too in Canada.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pull up some stuff as well. So when we talk about kind of Métis families in Edmonton, one of the names that's familiar and that we kind of talk about in public history a lot is the Garneaus. So the Garneau neighborhood in the old Strathcona area. And I'd like to maybe, Matt's pulling something up. I'm going to pull up some stuff about the Garneaus and how, how kind of the way that we talk about Métis people, they get co-opted.
Yes.
They get co-opted.
Oh, yeah. I love this bit.
Yeah. Well,
I think I talked about this a bit, but you got the paperwork, so I'll leave it to you.
Well, why don't you do the talking and I will get the visuals ready.
Sounds good. Yeah, so this is a really good example of how an assemblage of technically correct facts can perhaps even intentionally or unintentionally lead readers to the wrong conclusion. So I'm just going to wait for Christina to bring this up, but it really exemplifies that co-optation issue.
All right. I feel like maybe everyone can see like everything on my screen. I'm going to stop this for a sec. Yeah, so I'm pulling up pictures of the Garneau Cairn. So you can find this on 109th Street, kind of about like 85th Avenue. Awesome.
Oh, also to answer the question from earlier, I found the number, or rather, I found the percentage and then calculated the number. The Greater Edmonton area has a total Métis population of about 40,000. So it's sizable.
Yeah, thank you for pulling that up.
Yeah, and it's actually between birth rates, people learning history, and just like greater understanding of what Métis is. Those are a few of the factors as to the growth of that population.
Yeah.
But yeah, Métis and First Nations in the Edmonton area are about equal populations. Yeah.
All right. So can folks see the pictures that I'm sharing here?
Yep.
Yeah. So here we have the Garneau Cairn. So it is located in the Garneau neighborhood, right by the City of Edmonton's City Arts Center. A really nice, cairn, a nice little park, and it has some information about the Garneaus. So here's the write-up about the Garneaus. We have a picture of Eleanor and her husband Laurent. And then there's a description of talking about Eleanor Garneau. So I'm going to read it, and then let's talk about it. So Garneau left Michigan in 1859 to trade on the Missouri. After overcoming many dangers, including starvation, he was picked up on the prairie by Métis buffalo hunters from Pembina, found his way to Fort Garry, and then went to live for some time among the French Métis at Whitehorse Plains. He met and married a young blonde woman named Eleanor Thomas from the Scottish settlement of Kildonan in Little Britain. Eleanor was well educated for the period and spoke both English and Gaelic, while her husband also spoke French and Ojibwe. They went on to raise a large family. And so at last month's event, we spent some time kind of looking at this piece. And if you were kind of unaware of the hints within this paragraph, I think it's a fair judgment to make that a lot of folks would assume that Eleanor was European. Is that the case, folks?
No, most sources, there does seem to be some disagreement among sources as to her identity, but most primary sources where the debate exists are debating whether she should be considered Métis or Cree of mixed ancestry. Because she was born at Kildonan, which was a predominantly Scottish settlement, but it also had a sizable Cree village. And she was born in the Cree village. So it's unclear whether she would have been considered Métis or Cree. She was in fact blonde. And she was born in Kildonan, and Kildonan was part of a series of Anglican parishes in Red River, which was sometimes called Little Britain. But the statement, Eleanor was a blonde woman from the Scottish settlement of Kildonan in Little Britain, implies something very different and disconnected from what her personal identity would have been. So we're not sure if she was Cree or Métis, but in spite of being a blonde woman from Kildonan, she was not white. Mm-hmm. Or at least European culturally. She might have looked what we would consider white today, but that's a bigger discussion about phenotype and racialization that might be beyond the scope of tonight.
Yeah, someone was kind of asking about that, so we could maybe touch on it briefly, is like, what do we mean when we refer to whiteness? And does whiteness have a different resonance in the Métis context?
Yeah.
Amber,
sorry, go on.
That's all right. I was just kind of tossing things around. Amber, do you have anything that you'd like to say to that?
Could you just reread the question for me again?
Yeah. What does it mean when we refer to whiteness? I think we've all kind of brought it up. Does whiteness have a different resonance in the Métis context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that nomenclature definitely depends on like the context and the time frame in which we're using it. Like for back, in the 1860s, 1880s, or whatever time, white was being used to differentiate between the majority, I would say. And I think maybe, Matt, would that be kind of correct?
Wait, which majority? Which 1880s?
Like majority being like Métis or First Nations, and white kind of being like the identifier of that person is not part of.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you'll see script records with people who have, relatively low blood quantums, as little as 1/16 Cree ancestry, and they'll be identified as half-breeds.
Yep.
And if someone is, whether they're Scottish or French or English, sometimes their ethnicity is specified. Sometimes script records will just say, so-and-so, a white man.
Yeah.
And when the term white man is used, it seems to have more to do with someone directly from Europe or Eastern Canada.
Yes.
As opposed to what someone looked like.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because there's a few script records, I believe, like the Brazo family is a good example, where I think it's Papa Brazo, or the senior.
Was it J.E. Joseph?
Yeah, Joseph Edward Brazo. He's listed as a white man, and he was. And then I think another good example is the Noyes family, Noyes Senior. And then we have my great-great-great-grandmother's husband, who claimed script for their Métis and technically First Nations children. That's a little confusing, because they were treaty and they were Métis, so they took script and they took treaties, so that gets confusing. But he himself is taking script for his children, and he is white, and he's listed as a white man, and he is Irish. So yeah, I think that says quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, and again, going back to those individuals who did have a wide array of blood, but who were still considered socially half-breed, regardless of their, appearance, education, whatever. I think that's quite telling as well. Because, people who, for all intents and purposes, would be read as white today were still being considered themselves to be Métis. So I think that today whiteness is a lot more contingent on appearance, or like people are willing to ascribe that racial identity based on appearance, whereas historically it seems to have been more of a where are you from, who's your family kind of deal.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. Because again, we would have like Yellowhead, for example, like how do you pronounce his name? I always butcher it in French.
Teichon?
Yeah, Teichon. He's called a blonde, blue-eyed Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee. So like, we don't really know what he looked like, but based on his description, he looked white.
Or at least what would be considered white today.
Yeah, but you know, he's still being labeled as a Mohawk. So it's interesting that these words do change, and I think like settler is a good example of how these words change. Like settler is used in a different context today than it would have been used, you know, in 1880 or 1860. Yeah.
Well, and that creates a lot of interesting tensions when reading back into the historical record, because oftentimes, and I know I've had to unlearn this substantially, we read historical records with our sort of, I don't want to say ethnocentrism, temporocentrism, basically imposing culture, norms, language from today on that period without critically interrogating what it meant to the people at the time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So I think we do need to always be careful. Like, I mean, white was still a racial term in the 19th century, but it was less rooted in like your appearance and more, you know, at least in the context of Western Canada.
Yeah. I think that's just the overall theme going on, is like, you know, these like, I think in history, people were not so maybe divided in these racial categories, and where we do have just this polyethnicity that is common, and where we're, you know, post-reservation, like it just becomes a little bit more divided, and I think that's where these take on a different kind of nature.
Well, and I think the interconnectedness of the world we've come to live in since 1900 has sort of resulted in what is meant by these terms becoming a lot more homogenous. So whereas historically, what was meant by white was like being, you know, thoroughbred European, at least in Western Canada. You're either from, you know, Quebec, Ontario, or the old world.
Yeah.
Being white today has come to reflect a more metropolitan, like London or New York, understanding of race and ethnicity. So yeah, there were localized meanings of terms, like understanding of whiteness, understanding of like what the word settler meant, that have shifted to sort of a more metropolitan norm as Western Canada was integrated into the larger political economic sphere of the so-called Western world.
Yeah.
Sorry, that got really dense. I apologize.
No, that's good. It's the Q&A seems to be like asking quite a lot of these questions, so it's good we're having this conversation.
Geez, we might not even be able to get through all our own script with all these.
Well, how about we just kind of jump into these Q&A questions?
Yeah, sure.
I'm looking at the second one. So Elise Campbell is asking, when identifying as Métis and understanding your personal history, I've heard there was a lot of fear within Métis families in regards to being identified as Métis. Many people who have the heritage don't know, because for many years it was a stigma that led to discrimination. Considering how long the whole residential school system existed in Canada, did that play a part in the fear?
Yeah.
Oh, Amber?
Yeah, Amber, why don't you start us off?
I just, my family very much went through that, where they were shamed to identify as who they were. And that is a big part of the reason why I have, you know, been so keen to understand what happened to our family, and why they would not want that identity. With my younger generation, we're very proud of who we are, but that older generation, they still, that they have that sense of shame with their identity. And that is because, of course, yes, residential school systems had a play in it, but I think just overall the racial landscape, the tension that was early Canada a very toxic environment that bred a lot of these feelings and these insecurities collectively through our families. So and there's so much to that, down to policies, script, coercion. There's just so much to play into that.
For my own family's history, my grandfather, who is Métis, passed away when I was in junior high. So I never really had the opportunity to talk to him about these types of things. And so for myself, I always kind of knew that I was Métis, but wasn't really kind of shown how that manifested in my life or kind of told what that even really means. And it wasn't until I started working at John Walter Museum and engaging with primary source stuff at the archives and seeing my own family name, where finally this thing that in my mind happened so long ago was very much in the present. And since my grandfather's passed, I can't really ask him the questions that I want, but the little pieces that I've gone together, that I've put together, is that he was very shamed of who he was. Kind of putting this story back together has been really wonderful because my mother is a part of it. And so she tells a story about going to junior high in Jasper Place in the west end of Edmonton, and kids from Enoch starting to go to their school, and her just kind of having these little aha moments. And so she went home to her dad and asked, "Dad, are we Native?" And she told me that he said, it doesn't matter. And so I can't, I don't know from his own words what that is, but I've understood that his father went to the St. Albert Orphanage, which at that time wouldn't have been an official residential school, but it was run by the same people. So I can only, I guess, surmise that I think the residential school system was definitely at play in my family's burying of our Métis heritage.
I think that's a very relatable and unfortunately common story among our families is the kind of that ambivalence. I think it's the ambivalence is the term that we're looking for here, where they
and I mean that's kind of true in my family too. Pardon me. I once asked my grandma's brother why the family never talked about it. And he said, it was bad enough we were Catholic back in the 30s and 40s. If they'd known we were half-breeds, it would have been impossible to find work. So he just didn't talk about it. There was nothing to gain from it.
Catholicism is one of the main things that I can look in the Cunningham families. What are the Métis parts of our past that are still visible, or what's the strongest? And it was, the church. And I've been told that my grandpa was a real good jigger, but
that's awesome.
Yeah, I've heard the same about my great grandpa. He's said to have been very light and agile on his feet. A trait which I can't claim to have inherited. Agile, maybe. Light?
No.
There's a comment in our Q&A from someone named Robin that I think is really important for us to address. And I think this might be a good opportunity to check out that drainage system map that you had been pulling up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so if you could get that ready, and I will read out kind of, I guess, this comment that can lead us into our next bit of conversation. So Robin is sharing that it's really important, or they think it's really important, not to exclude the Métis from Ontario, from the Great Lake regions, who have been formally acknowledged as Métis and who do meet the Powley test. And there's a tendency in recent years to exclude the Métis who are from the historic homeland and to follow the same ethnogenesis as the Métis who descended from the Red River region. And I'm hoping we can maybe talk to this point, but within the context of kind of that drainage map that we were wanting to start
Yeah,
off with.
for sure. Can you guys all see it?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about this a bit. In my reading of the comment, if I recall correctly, oh, it disappeared.
It's in the answered section now.
Yeah,
just as
it
I'm
says
sorting things.
it's important to not exclude Métis from Ontario who are not from the Great Lakes region, but who have been formally acknowledged. So one thing that I really found when investigating the cultural geography of the Métis Nation is the importance of watersheds. And that's one of those things that when I had that aha moment, I honestly felt kind of silly for not realizing it sooner. Because the rivers were our main method of transportation. And so watersheds are a very natural system by which our cultural geography would evolve. So the biggest population of the historic Métis Nation could be found in this dark orange area, which is all the water flowing into the Nelson River. So that's the North Saskatchewan, South Saskatchewan, Assiniboine, Qu'Appelle, Swan, Red River, Souris River, Rat River, all the way up to the Lake of the Woods in Ontario. The Nelson watershed is the real core of where you would find Métis communities. However, it's also impossible to talk about Métis historic cultural geography without talking about the Athabasca Peace Country. So the waters flowing into the Slave River to the Slave Lake, because that was the prime beaver harvesting country. And then there was also quite a bit of activity throughout the Churchill watershed because it was situated between the Nelson and Athabasca. And then you also have some movement across the height of land into the upper Missouri country, particularly among buffalo hunting brigades. And these communities seem to have had a complex web of interrelations and interactions that were largely centered around Red River, but pretty much emanated throughout this entire dark area here. So from actually all the way down to the Judith Creek. When I originally drafted this, I wasn't super familiar with the Judith Basin Métis community in Montana. But I've since learned quite a bit, and so I would probably alter this map slightly. That said, yeah, there's definitely quite a few Métis communities in the Rat River Lake of the Woods area that feed into and experience the broader experience of Métis ethnogenesis and historical identity formation. And it makes sense, again, rivers being the main network, anything connecting to the Nelson River would have been part of that network. At the same time, after 1821, you don't see a lot of traffic crossing the height of land between the Nelson and Great Lakes watersheds. So that's what isolated the Great Lakes communities from the emergent Métis Nation in the West. Mm-hmm. But yeah, definitely there's a number of Ontario communities that are part of this broader stuff, particularly in the Rat River and Kenora, Lake of the Woods area. So I hope that answers that question or addresses it.
Looking through the list, this is kind of going back to the last time. So in the last conversation, Matt mentioned the language Bungi.
Bungi.
Is that still spoken in Métis communities today?
Yes, no, kind of, and it's complicated. It's characterized as a post-Creole, which means that it's a historic Creole that has since sort of decreolized and acquiesced to the standard form of the language in in Western Canada and in Canada more generally. That said, I have encountered a few elderly people who still speak with not only the accent, but some of the grammatical quirks of Bungi. It's quite rare, but I don't think it's fully extinct yet. Actually, a couple summers ago, I was doing some work out at Métis Crossing, and I met two people whose phonology and syntax, to me, could only be described as Bungi. So it's not completely extinct, but they were also both in their probably 70s or 80s. So if it is still spoken, it's severely endangered. Yeah.
Do you think you could, just for some folks who might not know linguistics very well, just clarifying Creole and what that post-Creole?
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So Creole is a mixed language that evolves out of a pidgin. When two people who speak different languages are interacting, their children will often, in situations where that language isn't fully comprehended, will adopt kind of a mixed language that simplifies its parents' languages. And I point this out because people will often describe Michif as a Creole, but it's not. Michif is actually a different kind of language called a mixed or an intertwined language, which is basically a Creole evolves in situations where neither party bothered to fully learn the other language.
Right.
Whereas an entwined or mixed language evolves where the parents of the children who developed it were fluently bilingual and code switched on the regular. So you have kids who are fully fluent in both languages, but speak a language that integrates both. It's why Michif has 4 grammatical genders and Bungi has 1. They don't even distinguish between he and she in Bungi. So.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
So it's a mixed language, but one that involves simplification rather than complexification. Michif is the other one. It's very complicated. Very complicated. Oh yeah, and post-Creole, sorry, I just wanted to point that out, is that like when those fully, when those pidgins, those trade languages are spoken natively, they become a Creole, but a post-Creole occurs when the speakers of that Creole over generations, bit by bit, abandon features of the Creole for the dominant dialect.
Someone just posted the encyclopedia definition of Bungi, saying that it is technically an English dialect. Is it an English dialect?
It's mutually intelligible with English. I would honestly say that Lowland Scots has a bigger influence on it.
Yeah, I would
but
think so.
English and Lowland Scots are mutually intelligible, so there's still debate among linguists as to whether Scots is a language or a dialect anyways, so. I guess if you consider Scots a language, then Bungi would be a dialect of Scots or a Creole of Scots. If you consider of Scots a dialect of English, then Bungi would also be a dialect of English by extension. That said, it would be even speakers today would be considered speaking in the dialect of English because it's decreolized so much. There's historical evidence to suggest that it integrated much more Cree and Ojibwe lexicon historically, and that those words have been progressively phased out for English ones over generations.
I think this is just like, it's not Edmonton history, but I just really love that negative history that the first English spoken in Japan was actually Bungi.
Oh man, that's a story for another day, but that is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
For
everybody.
Ranald with an A, McDonald with an A.
Yes.
Yeah.
First gentleman to go to Japan and speak English there and teach English, but he was in fact Métis from and was speaking monkey. So yeah.
Most likely. Like, we don't actually have records of the English he spoke, but he was living in a fur trade fort till he was 10 before he was sent off to Red River to be educated. So odds are.
Yeah, yeah.
Which, can you imagine Commodore Perry's surprise when he shows up and the Japanese English interpreters are speaking like they're from Manitoba?
I love it. It just changes.
Best mental image. Best mental image.
It is.
I have a question here that I think will have some good conversation. Would it be fair to say that Edmonton was essentially a community started by Métis who were expanding out of the fort? I think there's a lot of things that we can unpack in that question.
Could you hear that one more time for me? Sorry.
Of course. Would it be fair to say that Edmonton was essentially a community started by Métis who were expanding out of the fort?
I would say that's there's a lot of truth to that statement. It's not the whole story, but it's definitely like, it's a perspective I would agree with, even if I'm going to say that it's not the whole picture.
Yeah. I would say that's like it's part of a larger truth.
Yeah.
Like I would say, like, you know, it's also a First Nation settlement in of itself. And
that's why the fort was here.
Yeah, that's why
absolutely.
I was there.
Yeah.
I mean, like the Papas and the Cree, they had their own homesteads and implements and whatnot that they were farming with. So I think that it's a First Nations and Métis place.
And I think there could even be, like, when we're looking at like this as a place and then this as Edmonton, and just kind of what makes up Edmonton. And last session we were talking about how we can read Métis history into the landscape of Edmonton. We can say that a lot of Edmonton's, or there are many aspects of Edmonton's built physical layout that is coming from Métis people who were associated with the fort.
Yeah.
A question that connects back to that drainage map, but were the Métis people very migratory, or did communities settle for generations in the areas you showed on that map?
Yes.
Yes, Métis people were migratory.
No. They're both statements are true to an extent. Métis had a sort of seasonal round that involved, you know, you plant your grains, your crops in the spring. You go buffalo hunting in the summer. You harvest in the fall. During freeze up, you're processing your crops, getting ready for winter. Winter, you know, everyone's having their celebrations. You've got Christmas, you've got New Year's, you've got weddings. Then during breakup, people might go out on the trap lines or make other preparations. And then come spring, you plant your crops. Summer, you go for the buffalo hunt, rinse and repeat. So the Métis would be fairly sedentary for most of the year. But that doesn't rule out the fact that people frequently travel long distances from the settlements they were settled in. I mean, for my family, you know, we were at Red River as early as like 1821. And my family stayed there until the early 1900s when they moved to Athabasca country, or Peace country rather. Yeah, they were always within the broader settlement of Red River, but that doesn't mean that they were, you know, fixed in location 100% of the year. They moved around. You know, they'd go on the summer buffalo hunts, they'd go on the trap line in winter, they'd go up to Lake Winnipeg to go fishing. So yeah, you do have intergenerational settlement and permanency, as well as a significant degree of mobility, but that mobility shouldn't be seen as, you know, aimless or constant, but rather as a part of a larger seasonal round that was part settlement, part travel. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
I think it does.
Awesome.
Oh, we've had some new questions come in.
Oh.
This one's interesting. So the bicentennial of the merger of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company is next year. What would we like to see to celebrate or commemorate what this meant for the Métis Nation?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I guess
I can't say I've put it to mind before.
Why don't we talk a little bit about the significance of the merger itself?
Yeah.
To my family, I don't know if they would be happy about the merger. You know, I'm not sure if it was much of a celebration, but
Fair.
yeah. Let's talk about it though, Matt.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone enjoyed it.
Yeah.
The HBC had something like 500 employees and the Nor'westers over 1,000. And after the merger, the total employee count was cut to like 300 and something.
Yeah, lots of people lost their jobs.
Yeah. So I don't think it was a fun experience. But I also think that we need to acknowledge its historiographical importance because it brought Métis people or proto-Métis people from all the way up in like, you know, Slave Lake country and as far as the Columbia district and, you know, areas like Thunder Bay and down into the States. It brought Métis, or proto-Métis, I should say, because it's still in the process of becoming, all into a space where they interacted and mingled and developed a sense of shared identity and experience. And so I would agree with you that like no one was stoked about the merger, but I still think that as a historic event, its significance can't really be understated.
Yeah, I think a really good book that really kind of goes into a lot of that is Heather Devine's book, The People Who Owned Themselves, the ethnogenesis of a Canadian family. And just she really talks about, you know, how just like the Desjardins family and like the Calahoo families, and that's I know for my family, that's really where they kind of get their birth, their start as fur trade bands or free trader bands, and that's kind of where like they do kind of emerge, maybe like not as proto-Métis, but this is the beginnings of like that more national identity, I guess. Yeah.
Looking at our list of questions, we're working through them. Matt and Amber, has there been a question that you've been wanting to answer that I haven't brought up yet?
Were John and Gladue Quinn and his brothers the Métis members of the Papas Chase band? So they were not Métis. They were Cree of mixed descent, and were important to really, again, just to kind of go over. Being Métis is not being mixed. Being Métis is rooted in your cultural identity and who you are related to. It's also a personal choice. So you could have members of the Papas Chase who maybe did not want to be culturally Cree in Sundance, so they chose not to be. And maybe they live more of a Métis identity. Like that happened. My family were those people. Some of them have script, some of them don't. So that's it's a really important kind of piece of this picture that's needed to be understood of just like how these identities work. And the Papas Chase, again, they're very confusing because they are mixed identity. And some of them did take script, and some of their ancestors, or some of their descendants today, more confusing, do identify as being Métis. So it's a complicated question.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a gray area. I've only kind of come to the conclusion of Cree of mixed descent by talking to Papas Chase descendants and community members and getting a sense of how they see themselves and their ancestors. I know a lot of Métis people who are Métis through other lines, but when they talk about their Papas Ancestors, they will refer to those ancestors as Cree.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because there were a lot of members of the Papas Chase band who had Métis ancestry, not just mixed, but Métis.
Yeah.
They chose to live as Cree. And
Yes.
I think that that's something, you know, if that's how they viewed themselves and their descendants view them, that's something we as historians have to respect.
Oh yeah, totally.
And it's worth noting too that the Métis at Edmonton and St. Albert seem to have held themselves as distinct from, even while connected to, the Papas Chase people.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of telling, because even as people acknowledge their relationship to the Papas Chase band, there's still a sense of we are more like the people at this other settlement,
Yeah,
you know, Edmonton or St. Albert, than we are like the Papas Chase people. So
there is something that Heather Devine said in one of her books, where for especially further up north you went and further west you went, like the lines between First Nations and Métis was extremely blurry, and that they kind of were living sometimes, depending on the people, identical lifestyles, which led to more confusion when the reservation period comes into being, because all of a sudden people are now being told they are this based on blood quantum when they're actually something else. And like, yeah, do you think you could just kind of get into that a little bit with me?
Sure, yeah. Christina, do you have anything to add on that point, or before I get carried away?
No, go for it. I'm kind of queuing up our next questions, finding some themes. Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, the line between Métis and other Naheplatz groups really does get blurry around the edges. If we conceptualize it as a core periphery dynamic, each group of the Naheplatz does sort of have its core.
Yeah.
For Métis, that's the nucleus. For Métis, that's Red River and the North Saskatchewan settlement chain, as well as certain communities along the Missouri Coteau, like whether we're talking about Lewistown, Turtle Mountain. There's a few of them.
Yeah.
But anyways, when you get away from those really, really central supply lines and settlements, that's where the lines start to blur a bit. And even if you look at like the member groups in the Naheplatz, the Nakota, the Western Anishinaabe, and the Plains and Woodlands Cree, you'll find that each has sort of a core area where they were predominant. But then as you get to the edges of that core territory, they really blur into each other. There's a lot of overlap in those non-core areas. And so I think that, Neil McLeod has some really good research on polyethnicity among the Naheplatz, including, you've read that article, right?
Yeah, I have. It was a really fascinating article. And that was, that's kind of like how language can sometimes be like this, the first immediate layer of genealogy, which I thought was interesting. Yeah.
No, that's highly recommended for anyone who wants to check it out. Neil McLeod has some fascinating, he's a Cree scholar, by the by. Or wait, is he Cree or Anishinaabe?
I think they're Anishinaabe out there.
Genealogically, he's both, but...
Yeah, right, see, it's confusing.
He's also Assiniboine and Métis, if we're talking just about the genealogy. But the point of his research is that it explores sort of those ancestral ambiguities quite succinctly.
So I have two questions ready for us that kind of link together. So the first question would like some clarification around scrip and what scrip is. And then that connects to someone is wondering who the road allowance people were
So script is complicated.
Yeah.
I have spent years researching it. I'm still not convinced I fully comprehend how it operated.
What are the bullet points of what script was?
So script started as part of the Manitoba Act. The Manitoba Act guaranteed that a certain amount of land would be reserved for, and I quote, half-breed heads of families and children of half-breed heads of families. And so it was basically a land grant system in Manitoba to ensure that Métis would have access to land without sort of being, cordoned off on a reserve. That was at least what the people in Manitoba had intended when suggesting that sort of system. Mm-hmm. Its enactment was a nightmare. Mm-hmm. Now, as a historian, I have to admit that I'm grateful for script because it's an incredible archive for figuring out Métis historiography. But as a land grant system, it was a nightmare. Opinions differ as to whether it was, it failed as a result of intentional design or negligence. But whether it was designed to fail or just failed as the result of criminal negligence, the fact of the matter is that most Métis never received the land they were entitled to. Depending on the region, high bar numbers put it at 15% of Métis receiving their entitled land, with some lowball studies putting it as little as 0.1%. But even 15%, even the highball numbers are not great.
No.
And I guess to kind of maybe try to explain it at its most simplistic level and then expand from that, is that scrip was a coupon that folks could use for either land as individuals, coming from being Métis people, or scrip could be a money payout. Right? Just as kind of, do you think that's a fair way of just to kind of introduce that beginning part?
Yes and no. I will say that one interesting thing I learned about scrip relatively recently was that the money payout was not as straightforward as it sounded, because money scrip could only be redeemed in exchange for land. So it was basically a speculation certificate. Because if you could take the 240 acres now, then that's 240 acres. If the value of land goes up, then if you took money scrip, you're going to take a loss. But if the value of land goes down, if you took money scrip, you could potentially redeem that at profit. The value of land went up, so a lot of people who took money scrip and did redeem it for land still came out at a loss. But the important point here is that you couldn't actually redeem it for cash money, which is why a lot of people sold their scrip off at a loss, because they thought they were getting a money payment and they did not get a money payment.
And so to connect to the second question, who are the road allowance people and how does that connect to scrip?
Matt for that one.
So the road allowance people are really, they're the Métis who suffered the worst fallout from scrip BS, for lack of a more articulate way of framing that. So they were the ones who sold out but weren't able to reestablish themselves. They were the ones who couldn't retreat north, who couldn't pass for white, or who couldn't negotiate their way into treaty. Now, I want to say that looking into this, I don't think that more than maybe a quarter of the historic Métis Nation actually ended up on the road allowances. That's kind of my highball estimate. But for most of the 20th century, this subset of the Métis community was the most visible, and therefore really what was seen as the Métis experience for the 20th century. And their experiences really, by all accounts, were not great, wretched, to put it bluntly. They didn't have, because they didn't qualify for homestead land and had already spent their scrip or otherwise divested themselves of it, they didn't really have access to a land base. Now, between quarter sections and major roads, there's a little area called a road allowance. And people would build shanties on these road allowances because it was public land, and so you know, it was something they had access to. But yeah, so the road allowance people were the Métis who were really divested of all rights and title as a result of the scrip system, and who had no access to recourse beyond that. Yeah, they were really the most marginal of Métis. I can't think of a way to phrase this that isn't utterly depressing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering that one. It was, it's one that's not, I don't think many people know about as much. Again,
well, it's
so marginalized.
Which is kind of ironic because it's the 20th century Métis experience that we hear about the most, but no one really explores A, what it means, or B, how it came to be.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really the nuclear fallout of the failure of scrip.
Yeah. We've had another question that does connect to scrip. So someone says that I was told that scrip had some restrictive policy, and if you did not meet these requirements, you lost your scrip, i.e. putting 2 years to put agriculture in place with no tools or resources.
Oh yeah, so scrip was basically treated by the government as with a lot of the same requirements as homestead.
Yeah.
And people familiar with the Homestead Act will note that homesteaders were allowed 3 years to make sufficient improvements to their land, or else they would be, you know, the land would be reclaimed by the Crown.
Yeah.
Scrip was subject to this as well.
Yeah. So it wasn't something specific to the scrip experience. It was more so connected to the Homesteading Act and the expectation to use the land in a particular type of way.
Yeah, but the fallout was worse for Métis because a lot of the colonists who took out homestead, they came from somewhere and had somewhere to go back to. Now, we come from somewhere too, obviously, but our somewhere is here. And if you lose the ability to basically make use of land here, where are you going to go back to?
Yeah.
What recourse do you have? You don't have family back home in Ontario or Ireland or, you know, wherever else. Here is the only place you have. So if you don't meet those requirements fast enough, and this was especially problematic because the quarter section system is basically a grid, whereas Métis settlements are traditionally quite river focused. And so if you put a Métis person on a quarter section without a proximate body of water, it's going to be real hard to farm because we rely on floodplains to fertilize our soil. So the quarter section system wasn't especially suited to Métis agriculture, which combined with the fact that it was subject to Dominion Land Act regulations, and the fact that you know, people didn't have a lot of other recourse, really did contribute to the landlessness issue, even among Métis who received their scrip.
Someone just asked if if homesteaders got any assistance from the government. And maybe the second half of that question isn't written, that if, if the homesteaders got it, did that mean that the Métis people did not? And I'd say that the homesteaders did not really get any type of support from the government once you were out there. It was very much a, or at least when I'm reading accounts of women homesteaders and the wives of homesteading men, the government, they wanted you to come out here, but once you were here, you were kind of on your own to figure it out.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, that's a big reason why I think a lot of these groups would have fraternities or orders, and not to just throw that in there, but a lot of these people who would come out here who were early colonists would also often join groups like the Orangemen because they didn't have support networks, and that was just the support network that you would have, especially people who are coming here to homestead and land speculate. So that's a factor that is going on out here.
Yeah. No, yeah, the government, I will say, if there was a disadvantage that Métis were given, it's that the government would basically patent land to colonists for $10 for a quarter section. Whereas, like, if a Métis person was using money script by that quarter section, it would be $160.
Yeah.
So there is a difference there. But
yeah, and then there's I've also have noticed, of course, like many of the people who bought Papas Chase land in the Strathcona district, who were colonists, didn't even pay for their land. Many of them didn't pay for them. They were having issues keeping up with their payments. They were not making those improvements, and they were still, being given land. So homesteaders were given leeway that Métis homesteaders were not.
Yeah. That said, like in the day-to-day, like farm implements and stuff like that, the Métis had as much or as little access to, those kinds of goods as any other person farming on a quarter section.
Yeah.
But that also having been said, you have to bear in mind the role that socialization and social constructs of normalcy play into it. As the demographics shifted from predominantly Métis to predominantly white, and as Métis increasingly comes to be viewed as another, that identity is stigmatized, and Métis people are sort of given less social leeway. So while maybe the amount of government support would have been similar, the amount of social status that Métis people enjoyed really fades away as Métis shift from being part of a majority to being a minority.
Yeah.
All right, so we are about 15 minutes away from 9 o'clock. And I think we're just going to talk about maybe these two last questions before we head out for the rest of the night. So I think this is a really good one to go over, is in regards to Edmonton as a First Nations and Métis community, how far back does that go? If I were explaining this to someone who wasn't from this area, how should I describe the origins of the city? And then additionally, should I describe it as Beaver Hills House in that context? So let's go back to that first part. How far back does Edmonton's First Nations and Métis history go? And Amber, why don't you start us off with that?
Yeah, so from like archaeological records, we do have occupation underneath the Mazama ash layer, which was an eruption that happened over 8,000 years ago. So we know definitively that there have been people here since the moment Lake Edmonton drained and people could be here. People were following those melting waterways, and they were expanding into this area. And also outside of Edmonton, kind of like in the Genesee fossil areas, there has been Clovis tools found there that go back like 12,000 years. So Edmonton, again, is located in a really special place because it is a natural boundary between parkland and what's the other one? Prairie, Parkland and Prairie, Matt? Is that correct? I can't remember.
Sorry, Mike's off. Yeah, it's aspen parkland and mixed shortgrass prairie.
Yes.
For perspective on that, Montana, Minnesota, parts of North Dakota, or not Montana, sorry, Manitoba, North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, are what's called long grass or tall grass prairie.
Yep.
And that's a lot more arable. It's a lot more similar to aspen parkland. It's only once you get sort of around Battle River country that it starts to get drier and the vegetation kind of shrinks away. But anyways, sorry, I digress.
No, that's helpful. It's just like because of that natural boundary, that's why people are kind of, meeting in Edmonton, historically, especially more in ancient Edmonton. It has this confluence, all these waterways that meet. It has these natural boundaries, and it is also in a corridor that would have opened up, which would have been one of the early first migration routes into North America. It wasn't the first, but it was one of them. So Edmonton, again, it's like right in that corridor, that ice-free corridor, where it would have melted and people would have been coming not only down the corridor, but up it as well. So yeah, it's quite an ancient place, and its history goes back so far, and it's connected to just so many other places, because so much exotic trade material has been found in ancient Edmonton that really spans like all over across the continent. So Edmonton's a pretty special place. I don't think historically it was called the Beaver Hills. Isn't that further north?
No, Beaver Hills is in this area, but the term Beaver Hills House really does derive from the fur trade era.
Yeah, that's what I
mean, even the word house in there is kind of indicative.
From my understanding, so the Beaver Hills, the Misquachee, are to the east of Edmonton, kind of with Elk Island and Miquelon. I'm actually going to bring up a screen share. Oh no, I don't have it ready. I'm not going to do that. But yeah, I spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about Beaver Hills House and what that means when kind of using it in a territorial acknowledgement and why we choose to use that word. So a Misquachee Waskagan is Beaver Hills House. And the house part, from my understanding, is referring to Fort Edmonton. And so if a Misquachee was what we were kind of calling that larger area before, that could have been kind of the a potential pre-fort name, but that when I kind of think of a Misquachee Waskagan, that's very much kind of maybe not coming out of fort history, but it's a connection to the fort.
Yes.
And so, yeah, if anyone wanted to jump in.
To my understanding, even before the fort was built, one of the terms this area, I say down here in Calgary, the Edmonton area, was called was Pehonanek. It's sometimes shortened to Pehonan because that's the noun form rather than the locative form. Again, linguistic stuff. Anyways, but yeah, it basically meant meeting place. And people would meet, oh, sorry.
Oh, no. And I guess from my understanding, I've kind of come to relearn that multiple places were known as Pehonan.
Yeah. And as Cree was standardized in the 20th century, Pehonan or Pehonanek came to refer to Fort Carleton. And so a Misquachee Waskahikan was sort of adopted as the standard Cree name for Edmonton. But in earlier times, it was one of many great meeting places, or Pehonanek. So.
Yeah, I think it's important that it's not the meeting place. It's a meeting place.
Oh yeah, should bear this in mind to anyone who's not terribly familiar with Cree. Cree doesn't do articles, so or the, not a thing in Cree.
Oh, it doesn't do that.
Yeah, so context lets you know if it's or the. Typically, if you have more than one area known by the same name, odds are it's a meeting place. Whereas there's only one, Amiskwa Chiwaskahikan, so that is the Beaver Hills House. But they don't have a word that says or the. It's honestly, most languages don't cross-culturally. It's a weird thing that only like parts of Europe do.
Huh. Oh, English.
Not just English, even Hungarian does it, and that's not even an Indo-European language. But I digress. Anyways, point being, definite or indefinite articles are cross-culturally and linguistically rare. So Cree doesn't distinguish between and the in everyday conversation, but we can guess based on the fact that there are many places called Beaver, or not Beaver, meeting place, Pahonanek, that it was probably an indefinite article. A meeting place, not the meeting place.
I see a nice question that I think will be a good opportunity to kind of like wrap us up for the night. Time.
You're always so eager to wrap this up.
I know. It's my like sticking to that schedule. But I like this question. I think this is a good place to leave it. And I'd be really interested to know the folks who are still with us, what would be your answer? Tell us in the chat. So Tom Long asks that roads and neighborhoods in Edmonton, like Roland, Grote, Hardisty, etc., are named after Métis figures, but this is not obvious. Is there a way to emphasize or bring out these identities? Could you add an infinity symbol or a flag? Would this be useful to combat erasure of Métis history? And I have some pictures ready actually of these families, so I'm gonna get that ready while you folks chat for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's an interesting, definitely an interesting, really, really good question. Yeah, like, what can we do, I guess, in terms, like, we could maybe like color code signs, or, you know, add that infinity symbol for sure, but
yeah,
how do people know what those are?
I remember when I moved to Edmonton, one of my biggest points of excitement was seeing a Métis person who wasn't Réal or Garneau publicly celebrated, because like in the Garneau area, Réal or Dumont, because in the Garneau area, they had pictures of Lawrence Garneau on like flags up and down the street. And I found that really exciting. But I learned quite quickly that most Edmontonians didn't even realize he was Métis.
Yeah.
Their reading of those flags was another bearded old white guy, which, knowing Garneau's biography and personal life story, is a weird reading to me. But I also get that not everyone has taken the time to learn about him. So, like, yeah. But the thing is, I wouldn't want to also be like, I do like the idea of marking it with something like a little infinity flag or like a more subtle symbol, because I feel like if we tried to make it too obvious, we might risk playing into that imaginary Indian trope. And so, like, just basically saying, you know, this is like finding a way to present this is named after a Métis person, and whatever you might think of that, like, that is our starting point. That is our base assumption. Everything else is going to be refracted through that lens. I think that's, I don't know. I think that would be the best kind of approach. Something subtle, but still identifiable.
Yeah. Something like a color scheme or a color code that people could identify as.
Again, even
those
like a small flag in the corner.
Or like a tiny little flag or something. Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful dress she's wearing. My goodness.
Quite ornate.
Wow.
Who are they?
Is that a Garneau, maybe?
Oh, I thought that would have been...
the Groats, sorry. I had my mic off and I was
my brain kept saying Mrs. Christie. I'm like, no, not quite.
Yeah.
I was craving cookies, okay?
Matt, Amber, and I were chatting this week about, how do we make this history visible on our landscape? And the two things that I think would be really cool to see happen to kind of celebrate these names as Métis people. I want heritage minutes to come back. Like if we had little heritage moments,
we could do so
on our
much
LRTs,
with that.
Yeah, just like people, just like being able to see the pictures of these people or tell a little bit about their story. The other thing that I don't know if this would work, but I just love the visual of it, is similar to how some sidewalks are painted with the pride flag. Wouldn't it be so badass if there were crosswalks in these neighborhoods named after Métis people, but it was sashes all across? And maybe
you could even recolor the sash during Pride Week.
Ooh.
Yee, awesome.
I think that could bring new meaning to Métis Pride.
What I really like about, I guess, is like physically painting the street in sashes is like, it's kind of that curiosity a little bit, but people are actually like embodying and being in that space and having to like engage with it in a different way.
Yeah, marking it. Basically marking that which historically been unmarked.
Yeah, I mean, or like
I love this photo. I love this photo. I use this in my Laureate House exhibit. It's one of my favorites.
Tell us a bit about it. Who are these people?
So these three here in the center, or I guess center to left side, are daughters of Eleanor Thomas and Lawrence Garneau. And I believe the fellow on the outside is Placide Poirier. But I love how it's a formal photo sitting, and yet it's very there is kind of a subversive element to it. And like you can even see on the girls' faces, they're kind of holding back smiles. It's intended to sort of challenge the norms of the time, and I love that.
Yeah.
And they're having fun with it too, which is just like so cool.
Yeah. You don't always get those smirks coming through in the photographs.
I call them smirks. Those are like suppressed smiles.
They wouldn't be smiling. They're getting their photos taken and they're wearing awesome little hats and
they're dressed to the nines. It's amazing. That's one of my favorite Edmonton area photos just ever.
Me too.
Maybe we need to get those photos like these erected in places.
Have plaques. We should really have more plaques and interpretive signs. I think that's our biggest thing. Or like put a big sign on places like Rossdale or Mary-Low Bay Park or these places. Like it's not helpful just to have a name. We need a story to go along with the name.
Well, and I mean, especially when we're dealing with Métis people, and we've touched upon this tonight, and I touched on it in my last presentation, is that just giving people a name can be profoundly misleading in a Métis context.
Yes.
And so if we don't contextualize the individual, we really, really risk that level of erasure. So
the time has come, my friends.
Wait, before we all go,
We're starting our Métis goodbye.
Yeah, give it to like 9:30 optimistically. Someone posted in the webinar chat about like loving the idea of Edmonton Heritage Minutes. So one of you all got to follow that up, because that should be a thing. And I say one of them because they're both employed by the city of Edmonton as, people working on this project. I'm just a guest.
Our very knowledgeable guest.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, so but man, that would be cool to see. I would love for that.
Yeah, well, let's do it. We can always do a collaborative thing. So, I'll
Oh,
hire
absolutely.
you.
Yeah, we're all
Another
stronger when we're
consultation
working
gig.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Also,
yeah.
there were a couple comments on the Facebook feed that I feel like, I feel like we've ignored them a bit. So,
yeah. Well, let's take just a few minutes, but I think to be respectful of everyone's time, we do have to start
wrap
saying
it up.
goodnight.
Yes, I know. It's sad.
Yeah. What's catching your eye over there, Matt?
Do you think becoming Métis meant embracing the people of place and to some degree rejecting colonial culture? And is there anything to be said about that? That one really caught my eye because I think it's yes, but also there's a weird conflation historiographically with again, colonization and colonial whatever versus just something vaguely European. A lot of aspects of European culture that did integrate into Métis culture were things that the Métis people incorporated on their own terms. And the same can be said for First Nations. You look at beadwork. Beads in the fur trade came from Italy and Bohemia. But people found things that they wanted, they integrated them, but they didn't acquiesce to the broader ontological and epistemological understandings of European culture just because they used a European material good.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important to understand here because a lot of Métis, like aspects of Métis culture are influenced by European antecedents as much as they are by, our Naheplatz ancestors. But there is a fundamental rejection of the act of colonization, of having a foreign power assert control and power over us. I mean, there's a reason that almost every epitomizing event in both Western Canadian and Métis historiography can stemmed from a conflict between Métis and either the HBC or the Canadian government.
Yeah.
So there's a rejection of being colonized. That doesn't necessarily mean rejecting everything European, but it does mean rejecting having European people govern us and control our lives.
Yeah.
So I wanted to speak to that just because I wanted to disentangle sort of those two different notions of like European influence versus colonial influence.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think an important thing to note too that like colonization here happened way later than it happened in other places.
Yeah.
Contact is not colonization. And I think that's one that people kind of maybe have a little bit of a hard time wrapping their heads around. But I mean, the fur trade is not necessarily a point of colonization. There were some colonial things that the HBC did, but it's the First Nations and Métis very much were operating those economies, and it was their jobs. So, and something can be said as well is just for how much of an influence First Nations and Métis women had in these operatives. Like they were the ones more so than anyone else who were wanting these things, who were wanting glass beads from Italy or Bohemia, or who wanted textiles, because again, I think Matt, you've told me that the fur trade was 80% textiles or something.
Not quite that high, but it was around 60-65%. It was a majority of goods traded.
It's a lot. So I think a lot of us, we're always thinking that people are just trading for guns and stuff and tools and knives, but so much of it was for women, and then that says quite a lot to just again, they're not being like forced to take these things. They want them because they want them. They're not needs, they're wants. So yeah.
Yeah,
also,
oh, sorry, go on.
I was also going to add that a lot of the things that were being traded to the Europeans were things that were made and processed and belonged to the women. So all of the clothes, the moccasins, the food, the harvesting of grains and things like that, that was things that the women did. And yeah, we really kind of sometimes conceive the fur trade as something that occurred between men, but Indigenous women were playing a huge role in the fur trade.
Oh, absolutely. The men wouldn't have traded if it hadn't been for kin relations. And those kin relations were largely established through marriage.
Yeah.
Also, if I may, I wanted to double back to a point that Amber made about how colonization didn't begin here until 1870s, but the HBC did a lot of colonial things. And I think that's true. The HBC really wanted to be a colonial power. But they lacked something very important for colonization, and that was the ability to enforce their will. They're comedically bad at it. That said, I think it's still valid to consider the HBC an imperial power. Yeah. They were absolutely an arm of empire and actively involved in imperialism. But they, at no point, effectively maintained colonial control over the West. So that's a distinction I think is really important to bear in mind here. Colonization or colonialism and imperialism are not, they're related, but they're not quite the same. And I think that in viewing the HBC as imperial but not colonial, we get a much clearer understanding of the political economic landscape in Western Canada. Yeah, that really makes sense. Interesting.
And
because I don't want to elaborate too much, but would you say the Northwest Company was not imperialistic?
They absolutely were.
Yeah. Okay.
They were. They were a little more pragmatic in their imperialism, but they were absolutely out to expand commercial and political empire. Their goals were no different than the HBC's, even if their methods were.
Yeah. Cool. Just wanted to lump them into that there to who that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they were part of the British Empire too. They were the rank and file was mostly French Canadian, but management was still mostly Scots. Yeah. They were still from the British Isles. They were still part of that British imperial system. Yeah. Cool. Don't tell any Scots I said that.
Nat and Amber, I appreciate both of you being part of this follow-up conversation so much. And I know we haven't made it through all of the questions, but I do have to start wrapping things up.
We also didn't make it through all of the script.
No, we did not.
We got 3 paragraphs in before we got off track.
But we prepared the script, so at least we have something, and then we can go in different places.
Well, maybe after a few months we can reconvene for part 3.
I think that's a really great idea.
Make it a much delayed trilogy.
Yeah. Well, this has been really quite the treat, and I'm so happy everyone is enjoying it too. This is so awesome.
Yeah, man, I love these conversations. I know I have a lot of them with you guys privately, but to share these ideas, in a public forum is something really special to me.
Yeah. I'm really
Dream
thankful.
Come true.
Yeah, I'm really thankful that I have both of you to kind of turn to when I need to talk about these things, and I'm really appreciative that you joined us again for our ECAMPing trip. I want to thank Elise over there for helping us out in the back end. And
Thank
for
you,
Molly.
Elise.
Thanks, Elise.
Yay! And to Molly, who's been moderating things on Facebook. I really couldn't put on these events without you. And we couldn't do these things without everyone who came out and participated on this very hot summer night. Thank you so much for wanting to engage in the stories of this place and for making some time to come and be with us this evening. It really means a lot to me. I'd like to do some sharing quickly before we leave about some things that are going on with ECAMP. So we have ECAMP, in addition to offering programs like this, and once we are through this global pandemic where it's changed, we'll be able to do things like this in person where we can explore our city and discover the stories that surround us. But until we can be together, a way that you can learn more about the history of this place is through the Edmonton City as Museum Project webpage, where we maintain a collection of stories written from the perspectives of Edmontonians about the histories of this place. And so we have 3 brand new stories, one about Nellie Carlson and her work advocating for the reinstatement of status for Indigenous women, a story about connected to Edmonton's queer history by local playwright and drag queen Darren Hagen. And then we have Matthew Ducatz, who runs the Best Edmonton Mall YouTube series. He is a mall historian, and he has shared a story recently about Heritage Mall. So I encourage you to check out things on the ECAMP webpage. We do have stories about Edmonton's Métis history, and there will always be some new content coming on. Yeah, so from the very bottom of my history-loving heart, thank you so much, Matt and Amber, and all of the attendees, people who came to the last one as well, folks participating in the chat and answering questions. I'm just really thankful that we could come together and spend this time together. So thank you so much.
Thanks again for having us. And if I may, I'm proud that we only went 15 minutes over this time.
We're getting better. All right.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me, and all the best.
All the best. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.